Hey guys, you think your barber has it rough today? Try being one in the Middle Ages. You're not just trimming beards or shaping a fresh bowl cut. Oh no, you're pulling teeth with iron pliers, sawing through festering limbs, and filling basins with blood because some monk swears it'll cure his fever. And the shop itself? Forget the clean leather chairs and aftershave spritz. Picture a cramped little room that smells like sweat, candle wax, and pus. Tools reused without washing, cloths stiff with yesterday's gore, and a chair that creaks under every nervous backside. Every client who walks in is a gamble. Will they strut out freshly shaved, or will their family storm back in later with torches because you sent him to the grave faster than the Black Death? That was the life of a barber. The man everyone needed, but no one respected. The healer who doubled as a gossip monger. The surgeon who never studied anatomy. The tooth puller who never heard of anesthesia. A figure balanced somewhere between miracle worker and menace. I'm your tipsy historian. Pour yourself a drink, because trust me, you'll need it for this one. If you're enjoying these late-night dives into the darker, stranger corners of history, go ahead and like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy the ride. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? I like to imagine one of you sipping coffee at noon, while another is half asleep at 3 a.m., holding on like a medieval barber clutching his last leech. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step into the medieval barber's chair together, a world caught between grooming and gore, where your razor was just as likely to save a life as it was to end one. Step inside the medieval barber's shop, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight. It's the smell. A heady cocktail of sweat, candle wax, wet wool, and that metallic tang of old blood that never quite washes out of the wood. Basins line the walls, some full of water gone pink from its last job, others waiting for the next unlucky soul. Razors and shears lie on the table, gleaming faintly in the candlelight, their edges as likely to nick your skin as to trim it. Bloody cloths hang over the back of chairs like grim trophies, stiffened from yesterday's work. The clientele? Everyone. From peasants needing their beards hacked into something less vermin-friendly, to knights fresh off the battlefield with a gash in their thigh and an arrow still dangling from their shoulder. Barbers didn't discriminate. They couldn't afford to. If you had coin, you got a chair. If you didn't, well, maybe you got a friend to hold you down while he worked anyway. And here's the kicker. The barber's shop was more than a place for grooming. It was a community hub, a medieval coffee house where gossip flowed thicker than the blood in the basins. Want to know who's feuding with whom, whose daughter ran off, or which lord's got a nasty rash he doesn't want anyone to know about? The barber knew. While he scraped your stubble, he sharpened your secrets. The tools themselves were multitaskers in the worst way. That same razor that cleaned your beard might be used to lance a boil, drain a cyst, or open a vein for bloodletting. Efficiency, they'd call it today. Back then, it was just, don't flinch. Imagine trusting a man to tidy your throat hair with the same blade he'd used earlier to slice open someone's arm. And you had no idea whether he gave it a rinse or just wiped it on his apron. Now, pour another sip, because things are about to get worse. We're stepping into the barber's role as doctor for hire. Bloodletting, amputations, and surgery. Bloodletting. The medieval world's favourite party trick. You walk into the barber's shop with a fever, maybe a headache, maybe just feeling a little off. And what does he say? My friend, you've got too much blood. Let's fix that. Because in their minds, the body wasn't a bundle of organs and systems. No. It was 4 buckets of vibes, called humours. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And if your vibes were off, you'd better believe the solution was to poke a hole in you and let it drip. The tools? Oh, they had options. A phlegm, basically a tiny meat cleaver for veins. A handful of leeches, because nothing says spa treatment like a worm with teeth. And of course, the trusty knife, the same one that might have shaved someone's beard an hour earlier. If you were lucky, he'd at least dunk it in the basin first. Sterilization? Not a thing. Gloves? Please. The barber's hands were stained from 3 customers ago, and you were just adding another layer. But barbers weren't just opening veins for fun. They were also medieval trauma surgeons on the cheap. Got a bone sticking out where it shouldn't? The barber would yank it, crack it back into place, and maybe wrap it in whatever linen wasn't already soaked in blood. Arrow in your leg, he'd dig it out like pulling a cork from a wine bottle. Fingers black from frostbite, snip snip, fewer digits to worry about. Of course, infection was the real executioner here. You didn't die from the cut, you died from what came crawling in afterward. No antiseptics, no antibiotics, just a prayer and maybe a pint of ale to dull the pain. Because let's face it, ale was the only anesthesia on the menu. Barbers, in their own way, really did have a cure for everything. Problem was, the cure was often, well, death. But hey, at least you went out freshly shaved, right? Now, refill that cup, because we're about to dive into dentistry. Yes, the barber was your local tooth puller too. And if you think a modern dentist's drill is terrifying, wait until you hear what they used. Picture this. You've got a toothache that feels like a blacksmith is hammering your skull from the inside. No dentists, no Novocaine, no gentle radio playing in the background. Nope. You head to the local barber, who doubles as your tooth guy, and his toolset looks like it belongs in a torture chamber. Rusty pliers, iron tongues, maybe even a hammer if things get really spicy. And if the tools don't do the job? Don't worry, he's got bare hands. Yes, sometimes they just grabbed and yanked, like pulling weeds out of a garden. And here's the kicker. A lot of these extractions weren't done in private. Oh no, they were entertainment. Barbers would set up in the town square, plop you down on a stool, and while you scream, squirm, and pray to every saint you can remember, the crowd is munching roasted chestnuts, cheering like it's the medieval Super Bowl. Kids laughing, old ladies clapping, everyone having a grand time while you're losing more than just a tooth. Anesthesia? Please. Your options were ale, more ale, or passing out from the pain. Sometimes the barber's steady hand slipped, and instead of the tooth, he'd crack part of your jaw. Other times the tooth broke in half mid-yank, and now you're stuck with infected roots and an even bigger problem. Medieval dentistry wasn't about fixing pain. It was about trading one agony for another and hoping the second one killed you slower. And let's be real, you just winced imagining that, didn't you? Maybe rubbed your own jaw a little? And still, some of you haven't subscribed. That makes you the guy in the crowd eating chestnuts, laughing at someone else's suffering without paying the barber's fee. At least drop your excuse in the comments so we can all shake our heads and boo you like a bad act in the town square. Let's take a little breather from blood and broken jaws and step into the barber's safe zone. Hair. At least safer by medieval standards. See, hair wasn't just about looking neat, it was a billboard for who you were. Hair in the medieval world was basically a resume on your head. If you were a monk, your tonsure wasn't optional. It was church-mandated branding. Different monastic orders even had different styles of bald patches. The Roman style shaved just the crown, while Celtic monks shaved the front half of the head. Imagine walking into a medieval street and instantly clocking which sect someone belonged to, like rival football jerseys, except on scalps. There are even recorded disputes where rival clergy mocked each other's tonsures as the haircut of heretics. Knights and nobles, on the other hand, leaned into long hair and mighty beards. Chroniclers loved to describe kings by their hair. William the Conqueror's son, Robert Curthose, was mocked for having long womanly hair, while Richard the Lionheart was praised for his golden locks. Samson in the Bible wasn't the only one whose reputation sat in his mane. In fact, cutting off an enemy's beard or hair could be considered an act of humiliation, or even spiritual insult. Kind of like hacking their social media and posting cringe memes, except permanent. And don't think the common folk were out of this hairy business. Peasants couldn't afford fancy oils or combs, so their hair often went wild. Lice combs have been dug up by archaeologists from medieval cesspits. Yes, they literally found combs buried in centuries-old sewage. Imagine the dedication it takes to pick lice while sitting over a reeking trench. But hey, when your head feels like it's crawling, you'll do anything. Barbers were smack in the middle of all this follicular drama. They weren't just trimming hair, they were managing identity. A monk needed his tonsure perfect, a knight needed his beard trimmed to look fierce, and a merchant wanted to look respectable without drifting into noble vanity. A good barber was like today's influencer stylist. except his tools were more likely to kill you than glam you up. Now, case studies? Oh, we've got some juicy ones. In the 12th century, a monk named Orderic Vitalis wrote about barbers botching cuts so badly that men were laughed out of court. One poor chap supposedly had his hairline so mangled, people said he looked like he'd been scalped in battle. Even kings weren't safe. Charles the Bald, King of West Francia, got his not-so-flattering nickname after losing his hair early, a lifelong reminder that in the Middle Ages, a barber couldn't always save you from nature's cruel jokes. And here's a delicious irony. Medieval law sometimes regulated haircuts. In England, under the sumptuary laws, certain classes weren't allowed to wear their hair or beards in specific styles, because apparently looking too fancy could blur the rigid social order. The Crown literally told you how hairy you were allowed to be. Imagine a law today saying only CEOs can have beards longer than 3 inches. So next time you're sitting in your modern barber's chair, safe from lice, plague, and laws about your bangs, remember, in the Middle Ages, hair wasn't just vanity. It was survival, identity, and occasionally, comedy. Now here's where things get juicy, the Barber-Surgeon drama. The story of barber-surgeons isn't just a quirky footnote, it's one of the longest-running turf wars in history. It started back in the 12th century when the church officially banned priests from performing surgeries. The logic was simple: men of God shouldn't spill blood, which, of course, makes you wonder why it was still perfectly fine for those same priests to bless crusaders before they went off to stab their way across continents. But anyway, this left a gap. And nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. The men who stepped in were the barbers. They had the tools, they had the guts, and most importantly, they had access to people's bodies on a daily basis. If you're already trusted to shave someone's throat without slitting it, why not also cut into a boil, lance a cyst, or, in true medieval spirit, drill a hole into someone's skull to let the bad air out? By the 13th century, barber surgeons were practically everywhere in Europe. They formed their own guilds. In Paris, the Confraternity of St. Cosmas and St. Damian united barbers and surgeons under the patron saints of medicine. But here's where the class snobbery comes in. Proper surgeons were university educated, writing long Latin treatises and strutting about in academic robes. Barbers, meanwhile, learned their trade through apprenticeship, hands-on, messy and practical. To surgeons, barbers were just glorified butchers. To barbers, surgeons were pampered scholars who fainted at the sight of actual blood. And these fights weren't just words. In 1378, the French king Charles V had to step in and force surgeons and barbers in Paris to work under one guild, just to stop the bickering. But even then, they split into long-robed surgeons, the educated ones, and short-robed surgeons, the barber-surgeons. Guess who got laughed at for their clothes? Let's not forget England, where the conflict brewed for centuries. In 1540, Henry VIII merged the Company of Barbers and the Guild of Surgeons into the United Barber-Surgeons Company. Their symbol? The bloody barber's pole, representing bandages and blood-soaked cloths. But the partnership was shaky. By 1745, the surgeons had had enough and broke away, leaving barbers to just cut hair again. Imagine centuries of work, amputations, trepanning, bloodletting, and then being told, stick to the beards, buddy. Brutal. And then there are the case studies. Take Ambroise Paré, a 16th century French barber surgeon who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most famous surgeons of his time. He was basically the underdog Rocky of medieval medicine. Instead of pouring boiling oil on gunshot wounds, the standard cure of the day, he tried a gentler balm of egg yolk, oil of roses, and turpentine. Shockingly, his patients survived. He went on to write influential surgical texts and served several French kings, proving that a barber with practical sense could outdo the ivory tower medics. Or consider battlefield surgery. Barbers weren't just trimming monks' tonsures. They were out there in the mud, sawing off limbs after every battle. Knights would rather trust a barber who'd seen dozens of hacked-off arms than a book-smart surgeon who'd only written about them. Barbers got the dirty work, and because of that, they got the experience. Let's step into the barber's toolkit, shall we? Spoiler, it wasn't exactly the shiny steel and sterile gloves you'd see in a modern clinic. No, the medieval barber's instruments looked more like props from a horror movie, mixed with your uncle's toolbox. First, the razors, long, sharp blades, honed to slice through stubble or skin with equal enthusiasm. One slip of the wrist and congratulations, you've invented the budget tracheotomy. Then the scalpels, which were less precise surgical instrument and more small knife you'd find in a tavern brawl. Saw a boil, stab assist, cut a little too deep? Well, you'll either heal, or you'll meet God a bit earlier than scheduled. And if things got messy, oh, and they always got messy, out came the saws. Imagine a carpenter's saw, but used to separate a knight from his infected leg. Brutal, yes, but also effective in that you won't die of gangrene, but you might die of shock sense. Scissors weren't just for trimming hair. They were also for trimming flesh, trimming bandages, trimming, well, let's not get too descriptive, or you'll never look at your kitchen scissors the same way again. And when the patient squirmed, as patients tend to do when you're digging around in their gums with iron pliers, the barber reached for leather straps. Not for comfort, not for support. No, these were restraints. Because nothing says, trust me, I'm a professional, like tying someone down before you go in with a blade. And then there were the accessories. Bowls to catch blood, jars of leeches wriggling like a nightmare snack, all ready to suck out the bad humours. The humours theory said your body was basically a soup that just needed the right balance of ingredients. Too much blood? Drain some out. Too much phlegm? Good luck with that. Too much black bile? Pray. Too much yellow bile? Drink ale. Simple as that. Of course, here's the kicker. None of these tools were sterilized. Rust, dirt, bits of the last poor soul still clinging to the blade. Who cared? They wiped it on a rag and kept going. If germs could write Yelp reviews, medieval barbers would have been 5 stars. Filthy establishment, guaranteed infection would infest again. And yet, somehow, these men became symbols of trust. The barber's pole outside the shop wasn't just decoration. It was branding, red for blood, white for bandages, blue, later added in some countries, for veins. And the pole itself? That was the stick patients clutched onto while being bled, squeezing it so tight their knuckles went white. What you see today as a cheerful candy stripe was back then a literal sign that inside you could get a shave, a haircut, and an amputation, all in one sitting. And here's where I'll pause, because if you've made it this far through pus, rust, and leech jars, and you still won't subscribe, I've got questions. That's like saying, sure, I'll let a man saw into my skull with a rusty blade, but I draw the line at clicking a button. Go on, leave your excuse in the comments. We'll laugh at it together, like a crowd of medieval peasants enjoying a public tooth-pulling. So, picture this. You're 12 years old, skinny as a rake, and your parents just apprenticed you to the local barber. Forget school, forget childhood. Your new life is sweeping up hair, scrubbing bloody basins, and boiling tools that should have been thrown out 3 patients ago. Welcome to your education. You don't get textbooks, you don't get lectures, you get front row seats to the gore show. Your curriculum is watching the master barber yank a molar with one hand while steadying a man's head with the other, then being told, all right, your turn. It's like learning to swim by being tossed in the river, except in this case, the river is full of pus and the lifeguard is holding a rusty saw. Your first jobs are the easy ones, shaving monks' heads, trimming peasants' beards, maybe bandaging a small cut. But slip once with that razor, nick the wrong vein, and suddenly you're explaining why Brother Thomas bled out during morning prayers. The stakes are high, and so is the smell. And don't think mistakes were brushed off with a laugh. Oh no! A crooked shave, a shaky stitch, or a dropped tooth could earn you a cuff across the ear, a boot to the backside, or worse, public humiliation. Imagine cleaning chamber pots and sharpening razors at midnight while the master snores upstairs, all because you sneezed mid-shave. Apprenticeship wasn't character building, it was survival training. Years later, if you endured the sweeping, the scolding, and the steady stream of blood-soaked lessons, you might claw your way up to journeyman status. And only after countless botched beards, shaky stitches, and near-death dental experiments could you finally dream of hanging up your own barber's pole. By the time you've clawed your way out of apprenticeship, you're not just a barber, you're the beating heart of the community. Your little shop isn't just a place for haircuts and bloodletting. It's the medieval equivalent of Twitter, Tinder, and the town square rolled into one. Step inside, and you'll hear everything. Who cheated on their tithe, which noble is bankrupt, whose daughter is mysteriously pregnant. You're the barber, but you're also the town's gossip broker, spinning secrets while stropping your razor. People trusted you with their throats, literally, so naturally they trusted you with their scandals. If you wanted the news before the crier rang his bell, you didn't go to church. You went to the barber's chair. And when it came to health, peasants would rather see you than a wandering doctor. Why? Because the doctor was expensive, smelled like alchemy smoke, and might kill you with experimental potions. The barber? Cheaper, faster, and at least you knew what you were in for. Pain, blood, and a 50-50 chance of survival. Honestly, not a bad deal for the Middle Ages. In towns, you might be shaving the mayor one day and lancing a farmer's boil the next. But in armies? Oh, that's where things got spicy. Travelling with campaigns, you'd spend your mornings trimming knights' beards and your afternoons sawing off their infected legs. Imagine the contrast. A knight thanking you for his clean shave, then screaming into a rag as you hack through his thigh a few hours later. From vanity to battlefield trauma, you were always in demand. Barbers marched with armies because someone had to deal with the aftermath of arrows, swords, and maces. And let me tell you, arrows were everywhere. Stuck in arms, thighs, and sometimes in places too awkward to describe without wincing. Your job was simple. Get it out fast. Tug with pliers, twist with knives, or shove the whole thing through if you had to. Gentle wasn't in the vocabulary. And when infection set in, which it always did, out came the saw. Imagine a knight in full chainmail, proud as a lion, suddenly reduced to begging you, the town gossip with a razor, to spare his life by taking off his leg. You didn't have anesthesia. You didn't have antiseptic. What you had was a wooden stick for the poor bastard to bite, 2 strong men to hold him down, and the speed of your sawing arm. Precision didn't matter. Getting it done before the patient died of shock, that was the measure of success. Cauterizing was the grand finale. Heat the iron until it glows, press it against the stump, and let the smell of sizzling flesh announce your success to the entire camp. If you think a barber shop smells bad after a long day, imagine one that doubles as a barbecue pit. Survival rates? Grim. But better than nothing. Without you, the knight dies of blood loss. With you, he dies of infection 3 days later. But hey, at least he got to say goodbye to his squire. That counted for something. And let's not forget, speed mattered. The quick cut wasn't about style. It was about sawing through a femur in under a minute. Congratulations. Barbers basically invented the speedrun amputation. The only problem was, sometimes that quick cut, it was the last cut. And now here you are, safe, whole, and not clutching a stump where your leg used to be. You've survived arrow removals, sawdust surgery, and the smell of roasted night, and you still won't subscribe? That's like refusing to thank the barber who just saved you from bleeding out on the battlefield. Hit the button. Now, let's keep the chair warm, because next we'll peel back the bloody curtain on just how deadly this job really was, not just for the patients, but for the barbers themselves. As a medieval barber, it wasn't just your patients who died young. The job itself was a slow-motion death sentence. Day after day, you're elbow deep in blood. Strangers' blood, neighbors' blood, sometimes blood from that same knight who swore he'd never cry but screamed like a goat when you pulled his tooth. Every cut you stitched, every boil you lanced, every limb you sawed off, left you one nick away from infection. No gloves, no antiseptic, just your bare hands marinating in a cocktail of pus and plague. And the strain didn't stop at disease. Imagine squinting by candlelight for 16 hours a day, razor in hand, trying not to nick an artery while balancing on a crooked stool. Your eyes go first, then your spine. Hunched backs and crooked fingers were the badges of your trade. Every barber walked like a man who just lost a bar fight, because in a way, he had. Only the opponent was a lifetime of lousy posture, and then came the plague. Barber shops were perfect breeding grounds for disease. Close quarters, steady traffic, blood-soaked cloths reused until they could stand on their own. One sneeze, one cough, and suddenly your little shop of horrors became a Black Death dispensary. Many barbers died not from the blades in their hands, but from the coughs in their customers' lungs. So how did they cope? Well, the same way a lot of people still do, by drinking. Ale, wine, mead, whatever numbed the edges of a day spent cutting throats both intentionally and accidentally. Alcoholism wasn't a vice so much as an occupational hazard. If you were a barber and not drinking by sundown, people probably thought you were possessed. Now, let's raise our cups and peer into the darker corners of superstition and ritual, because barbers weren't just surgeons and gossips. Sometimes they were dabbling in things a little more mystical. If you thought medieval barbers relied only on steel and steady hands, think again. Half their toolkit wasn't made of iron at all, but of prayers, charms, and the occasional glance at the stars. See, in a world where disease was mysterious and death seemed random, people wanted more than just a blade. They wanted reassurance that their barber's razor was guided not only by skill, but by something higher, or at least something cosmic. So medicine and religion went hand in hand, like blood and bandages. Take astrology, for example. Barbers didn't just bleed you whenever they felt like it. No, they'd often check the moon. Was it waxing? Waning? In Aries or Virgo? Certain phases were believed to be better for draining blood, while others were thought downright dangerous. You didn't want to be bled while the moon was in Libra, because apparently that messed with your kidneys. Imagine lying in a chair, arm outstretched, while your barber squints at the sky and says, "Sorry, can't bleed you today. Mercury's in retrograde." And then there were relics. Some barbers swore by them, a saint's tooth, a vial of holy water, even a splinter from the true cross if you were lucky or gullible enough to believe it. They'd press these objects against wounds or mutter blessings over you as though the relic could suck out the sickness. Sometimes the relic did nothing, but hey, so did the leeches. Charms and curses weren't far behind. People feared the evil eye, and a barber might quietly hang a charm in his shop to keep demons from slipping in with the customers. Others whispered prayers over basins of blood, asking saints to forgive them for spilling so much of it. And if you were particularly devout, your barber might start the procedure with the sign of the cross, right before cutting into your flesh like a butcher at market. Case studies? Oh, plenty. In 1494, a barber-surgeon in Germany reportedly refused to bleed a nobleman because the stars weren't aligned. The noble insisted anyway, and wouldn't you know it? He bled to death on the table. For the barber, it was proof. Ignore the heavens, pay the price. And in England, there are records of barbers advertising their services with promises like all cuts blessed and guided by the Virgin herself, which of course was mostly marketing, medieval clickbait, if you will. It all sounds ridiculous now, but for them it was deadly serious. Medicine wasn't separate from religion. It was religion, tangled up with rituals, prayers, and the occasional muttered curse. Your barber might shave your beard with one hand and wave away evil spirits with the other. A haircut and an exorcism, all in one sitting. So, let's talk about the long, slow death of the barber-surgeon, a decline every bit as bloody as their trade. For centuries, these men had ruled the middle ground between grooming and gore. They shaved monks, stitched peasants, amputated knights, and gossiped about nobles. But as Europe shuffled its way out of the Middle Ages and into the so-called Age of Reason, things began to change. And spoiler, those changes weren't kind to the barber with a saw. The first big blow came from universities. Starting in the 13th century, places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford began teaching medicine as an academic discipline. Suddenly, you had men in long robes reading Galen and Hippocrates in Latin and looking down their noses at the guy with bloody rags stuffed in his apron. We, the university-trained doctors said, are men of science. Meanwhile, the barber was still hunched in his shop, sawing away at some farmer's abscess with tools he wiped on his sleeve. By the 16th century, the split was official in many countries. In France, surgeons began organizing themselves into distinct guilds separate from barbers. In England, Henry VIII tried to hold them together with the Company of Barber-Surgeons in 1540. Imagine a forced marriage between the guy who cuts your fringe and the guy who cuts your leg off. But even then, tensions simmered. Surgeons wanted prestige, barbers wanted recognition, and patients just wanted to survive. Case in point, Ambroise Paré, the famous French surgeon of the 1500s, started out as a humble barber surgeon. He rose to prominence on the battlefield, pioneering techniques that actually saved people instead of just bleeding them dry. But Paré made a point of distancing himself from the barbers. His success widened the gap. Surgeons were moving up, barbers were sliding down. By the 18th century, universities had fully professionalized surgery. Surgeons wore fancy gowns, collected degrees, and strutted around hospitals. Barbers, meanwhile, were told to stick to shaving and haircuts. The saws were taken from their hands, and with them, the last shreds of their medical credibility. Some barbers fought to keep their dual role. In rural areas where no real doctor would bother to tread, barbers continued pulling teeth, lancing boils, and bloodletting well into the 19th century. There are records from German villages as late as the 1830s of barbers still being called the surgeon when someone broke a bone. But in cities, forget it. By then, your barber's job was to trim your beard and gossip about the doctor's fees. The decline wasn't all bad, though. Modern barbering rose from those ashes. The men who once wielded scalpels and saws now mastered scissors and combs. They became stylists, image makers, and, in a way, therapists. Still the keepers of gossip, but without the buckets of pus. The barber's pole survived too, spinning on into the modern age, long after the blood it symbolized had dried. So here's the irony. The same barbers once mocked as butchers with razors eventually became the guys we trust to make us look sharp before a date, a job interview, or a wedding. They lost their surgical knives, but kept their place in society. Not as lifesavers, but as life-shapers. So here we are at the end of it all. The blood-soaked apron hung up, the razor dulled, the saw laid to rest. What do we make of the barber, this strange figure who straddled the line between healer and entertainer, butcher and confidant? Their legacy is a messy one, but maybe that's fitting. After all, their entire career was about cleaning up messes, with mixed results. On one hand, barbers were the unsung medics of the Middle Ages. When you broke your arm, when a tooth rotted in your jaw, when an arrow lodged itself in your thigh, it wasn't the lofty university-trained doctor who came running. It was the barber, apron-stained, tools clinking, half gossip, half surgeon. They didn't always save lives, but they tried, and for that alone, millions of peasants owed them debts they couldn't put into words. Without them, entire villages would have been left to bleed, rot, or pray their way to the grave. And yet, the barber was also the butt of endless jokes. Medieval plays and satire loved to mock them as bumbling fools. One minute they're solemnly reciting a prayer over your wound, the next they're cutting off the wrong toe. To the upper classes, they were comic relief, the butchers with razors. To the common folk, they were both saviour and menace. Respect mixed with ridicule, a double identity they could never shake. The barber's shop itself became a kind of stage. Think about it. It was where villagers came to gossip, share news, and laugh at each other's misfortunes, all while someone bled in the corner. In one corner, a man's getting his head shaved smooth for monastic vows. In another, a soldier's having his arm stitched after a tavern brawl. And in the middle, a crowd swapping jokes about the barber's clumsy hands. It was the ER and the comedy club rolled into one. Case studies make this even clearer. Records from 14th century Paris note that barber shops were houses of noise, filled with chatter, arguments, and the occasional scream. A chronicler in Florence complained that barbers talked more than they cut. And an English satirical poem from the 15th century pokes fun at the barber who draws blood from the arm and gossip from the mouth. Imagine leaving with a shaved chin and your entire private life suddenly public property. Even as they faded into pure grooming, barbers carried this legacy forward. That's why the barber's chair today still feels like confession. You sit, you spill your secrets, and the person with the scissors listens. It's the faint echo of that medieval double life: healer, entertainer, gossip-monger, friend. And here's the punchline. You've just sat through nearly 3 hours of blood, guts, pus, gossip, superstition, plague, and laughter. And you still won't subscribe? That's like walking out of a barber's shop with half a beard saying, good enough. Don't insult me like that. Hit the button. Or at the very least, drop your excuse in the comments so we can all point and laugh like medieval villagers mocking a barber who just shaved the wrong monk bald. So raise your cup, friend. To the barber, the man everyone needed, no one respected, and history almost forgot. And to you, for surviving the journey. Until next time, keep your blades sharp, your drink strong, and your curiosity sharper still.